Welcome to FO Talks. With me is my dear friend Abdullah Hayek. He's an independent Middle East analyst based in Washington, D.C. Today we are going to talk about what's happening in Gaza. Abdullah, for our global audience, can you break down the key elements of the Israel-Hamas ceasefire? And for many of our viewers who may be watching us right now, it's the 22nd of October. Israel has carried out airstrikes in Gaza. They say they have struck Hamas. Hamas says that Israel has bombed innocent civilians. Abdullah, what's really going on? Does a ceasefire still stand?
Thank you, Rohan. It's great to be here once more. I'm very delighted to be here. The ceasefire that was publicly announced, it was signed in October 9th, effective October 10th. It was signed in the Red Sea resort city of Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. It represents a complex and multi-phase roadmap rather than just a simple halt in fighting. There are hinges on interlocking conditional obligations involving hostages, troop movements, humanitarian access, disarmament, government transitions, the day after everything. Now, under the publicly described stage one, phase one, Hamas is required within 72 hours to begin releasing Israeli hostages, the remaining surviving ones, which were 20, and also the remains of the deceased hostages 72 hours afterwards, which were believed to be up to 28 bodies. In return, Israel was required to release nearly 2,000 Palestinian detainees, including 250 of them who were serving life sentences, and it was required to initiate a partial withdrawal of its forces to agreed upon lines within Gaza. The White House shared graphics of this on their X page. Now, at the same time, Israel has pledged to open key border crossings, mainly in Rafah on the border with Egypt. And they should allow humanitarian aid, humanitarian medical aid, allowing basically hundreds of trucks of aid daily to flow into Gaza to relieve the dire shortages of food, water, medical supplies, and fuel. The deal also stipulates that reconstruction of Gaza shall be funded by the Arabian Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and many more. It also stipulates that a joint Arab International Stabilization Force or peacekeeping force will oversee security, verification, policing tasks during the transitional period. Now, one of the more contentious clauses, which brings us to phase two, is that Hamas must fully surrender heavy weapons, and that includes rocket stockpiles, its tunnel networks, its command and control assets, everything, and that should allow intrusive verification mechanisms. Now, importantly, the ceasefire includes built-in triggers and remedies. Part of the ceasefire, part of the 20-point plan that was revealed by the White House just a few days before the actual signing of the ceasefire, it includes Israel reserves the right to re-engage militarily if Hamas fails to comply on key benchmarks, which includes the false identifications of remains, refusal to hand over arms, and it also reserves Israel the right to restrict aid or close crossings as leverage. So in practice, the ceasefire is conditional. It is not absolute. The Israeli withdrawal is not absolute. The ceasefire has these gaps that can be taken advantage of to serve the interests of either Hamas or Israel. But it is calibrated to compliance levels. So Hamas is expected to progressively cede its governing and military roles. Governance is supposed to, within the 20-point plan, to shift over time to a new governing Palestinian body. Now, the international community, in particular, the Arab states, want it to be surrendered to the Palestinian Authority. Israel and the US, within the plan, want a new Palestinian body established to take over, and they will only allow the Palestinian Authority to take control of the Strip only if it is fully reformed and under strict international supervision to do so. And Hamas wants to surrender the Strip only to an independent body of Palestinian technocrats. Obviously, a lot is going on around there, but the concept of this, where three different sides want three different, let's say, governing bodies, brings us to another question, which is how are we going to do it? The first step, obviously, is that Hamas should surrender its weapons. Now, Hamas right now is not surrendering its weapons, which will bring us to the second part of your question. But the agreement further underscores, I think this is very important to mention, it underscores that aid, reconstruction, and legitimacy are all contingent on the compliance of Hamas to disarm. And the failure of Hamas to return all bodies or to destroy all heavy weaponry may constitute immediate violations, which we have seen, and we will get to that. So, in short, the ceasefire is not a passive peace agreement, but it is a delicate step-by-step framework, a transactional framework of mutual obligations, enforcement escalators, and transition mechanics. They are all intended to manage the enormous risk of renegotiation in a very much deeply fractured conflict. Now, the ceasefire was in effect on October 10th. Surprisingly, that's a sarcastic surprise to no surprise. On October 13th, just 3 days after the ceasefire was effective, Israel immediately accused Hamas of violating the ceasefire when it returned the remains of, I think, 4 deceased Israeli hostages. The issue was, I believe, that there was a body of one of the hostages that was in fact not an Israeli hostage, but was in fact a Palestinian informant working with Israel that Hamas managed to take capture of and died within Hamas captivity. Hamas states that it faces obstacles in recovering the bodies, as not all the burial sites has been identified. But this is an issue that the world as a whole recognizes, because even a spokesperson for the International Red Cross has warned that it would be a massive challenge to find the remains of all deceased hostages amongst the rubble, because as we all know, 97% of the Gaza Strip right now is under immediate rubble. But however, there are also maneuverings around this that can help prevent the collapse of the commencement of phase 2 without Israel resorting to renewed aggression. And as we've seen Qatari and Turkish and Egyptian construction equipment and heavy machinery that are tasked to remove the rubble and proceed with helping and finding the remains of the Israeli hostages. They've even faced backlash from numerous Gazans that they've actually taken a priority in locating the remains of a few Israeli hostages rather than help find the remains of Gazan casualties. So the ceasefire is being committed by nearly everyone in the ceasefire process except Israel, because Israel went ahead and immediately began launching airstrikes. And there is also fault on Hamas, because Hamas has taken matters into its own hands, in which it believes that if there's no second phase of negotiation over these minor issues, I'm going to resort to airstrikes as a whole. Now, this causes friction. This causes massive casualties, renewed cycles of violence. And Hamas is obviously taking matters into its own hands, where it's basically launching massive retribution operations against those it believes were basically in the cahoots with the Israelis in terms of cooperation or anything related in terms of an affiliation with the Israelis.
Okay, so the ceasefire is conditional, and you've spoken about how there are some loopholes in it. But I want to dig deeper. How did Hamas and Israel even agree to this? it's not like this was the first time that they were basically brought to the negotiations table. This has been a process for months. But this time, there was an agreement that a ceasefire would be agreed upon. Was it because of pressure from US President Donald Trump, or was it because the fighting was eventually taking a toll on both sides?
It's a very good question. I think that the ceasefire agreement did not arise from a single cause, but from a convergence, a mix of strategic exhaustion, domestic and international pressure on all sides, shifting regional incentives, and the unique interest and intercession of Donald Trump's high stakes diplomacy, in which he wants to be remembered as a peacemaker. After nearly 2 years of the war, beginning October 7th, 2023, both sides confronted diminishing returns. Gaza lies in ruin. Civilian casualties are unprecedented. There are numbers all around, but to be safe, it's safe to say that there is at least 70,000 Palestinian dead in the Strip. Many sources say it's way over because many haven't been identified due to the rubble. Infrastructure is shattered. 97% of infrastructure in the Strip is gone. And the repercussions of this, the humanitarian collapse, they indicate that famine, disease, not to mention the already mass displacement in place, are all pending. Israel, despite the military dominance, absorbed rising costs. It has domestic war fatigue, especially that Israel's traditional manner of conducting warfare barely lasts over a couple of months. This war has been Israel's longest. It's caused a lot of unpleasant opinions within the Israeli fabric of society itself. There's been massive international condemnation. We've seen the wave of Palestinian statehood recognitions in Europe and Canada and Australia, all of which have been unprecedented and have affected Israel on the long run. We have logistical overstretch because Israel was not just engaged in the war in Gaza, it was engaged in Lebanon, it's engaging in airstrikes in Syria, it literally had a 12-day war with Iran. Every now and then it goes ahead and strikes the Houthis in Yemen. So Israel is really overstretching itself in terms of its capabilities on logistics. And most importantly, within Israel, I think the political instability and the backlash within Netanyahu's own political coalition. Now, it's important to note that Israel had already begun signaling tactical pullbacks, prioritizing border control over just fully conquering the Strip. We've heard voices within the Israeli Knesset, the Israeli cabinet, that they do not want to withdraw from Gaza. They want to annex the Gaza Strip. They want to kick out the Palestinians. Sure, that is all true, but within the central Israeli government voice, it does not indicate that, nor does Netanyahu want to do that. But he still wants to maintain an Israeli presence. Now, on the Hamas side, internal strains obviously intensified. The anti-war protests that erupted across Gaza by the Gazan people themselves, demanding an end for Hamas rule and Hamas dragging the Strip into endless war, pleading for relief, that all affected Hamas very much so. We've seen protests erupt since March, with a few protests exceeding in numbers about 50,000 to 60,000 Gazans within the Strip calling against Hamas. That is very unprecedented. Usually the fear factor prevented them from mobilizing and voicing against Hamas rule. These two really affected Israel and Hamas on that end. Now we have to remember that there are also, for Hamas, rival clans and militias repeatedly are challenging Hamas's monopoly amid the chaos right now in the Strip. And it sometimes, well, not sometimes, 90% of the times, even more to be safe, it is with covert backing from Israel. So Hamas's capacity to sustain this prolonged armed resistance, as it so claims, is eroding faster than it can count. And it found itself forced to reconsider its posture and risk its existential defeat, which is already pending. Meanwhile, many regional actors, in particular Qatar, Turkey, and most importantly Egypt, had for 2 years long mediated the interim ceasefires and hostage exchange. They created latent diplomatic channels. They were very interested in ending the war, and their involvement really pushed the ceasefire more to the finish line. Also, at the global level, as we've seen, not just in the UN with the Security Council resolutions and everything, we've seen that Europe is trying to make a change in ending the war by recognizing a Palestinian state, which will obviously upset Israel, but also to prevent the advantage to be fully against Israel. They've very strictly insisted that the recognition be included, that it does not involve any Hamas governorship or role in a Palestinian state in the day after. So into this vacuum of urgency, stepped in Donald Trump, who, having met Benjamin Netanyahu 4 times since he assumed his second term in the White House in January, he brought basically renewed American resolve. He was really determined to end the war. He's made it very clear during his campaign run the year before that he wants to end the wars in Ukraine and Gaza. Obviously, Gaza is a much easier task than Ukraine, that involves a massive power like Russia. Whereas in Israel, Trump has leverage over Israel. Trump's incentive is basically designed to bind both parties under strict enforcement deadlines, Reconstruction incentives, regional guarantees, all that we've mentioned. But his arrival was not the origin of the diplomatic process, but it was rather the accelerant, really, the big push towards having it reach the finishing line. Now, Trump's political capital, the American coercive weight, and the threat of restoring force if Hamas, turned back into violence, really played a role. That has to be mentioned and considered. The provocative social media engagement of Donald Trump on Twitter and Truth Social really played a role. We've never seen before that diplomatic engagements or presidential statements are expressed on Truth Social in such a unorthodox manner. So I think the ceasefire succeeded because the fighting had already taken both sides to the brink, and basically Donald Trump stepped in at a precise moment that played into his advantage to basically trap rational actors into a framework that they could not credibly refuse.
But do you think the ceasefire deal is going to last? And if not, what are some ways that could basically trigger the ceasefire from collapsing? As we already know, Israel has carried out airstrikes today. So do you think this could be one of the reasons? And basically, what's going to happen if the ceasefire collapses?
The fragility of the ceasefire is enormous, in my opinion. And while survival of this is possible, failure is the more likely path, only absent of implementation, external resolve, and political stability on both sides. There is, in essence, there is a chance for it to survive. But if it's going the way it's going right now, it will collapse. Now, the architecture of the deal itself reveals several failing points. I believe that the hostage return and body identification requirement is a tipping clause because Israel has already accused Hamas of misidentifying one body in the handover process and has threatened to cut aid or retract concessions over delay. That is not a rational exchange ratio, in my opinion. If Hamas is failing to go ahead and be committed to the hostage restoration and surrender, what does the Palestinian people in Gaza have to do with it? Why is it that Hamas's punishment is humanitarian withdrawal? Also, Israel, as I mentioned, reserves the right to resume operations if Hamas fails these key benchmarks. Even minor deviations can escalate rapidly. Also, I believe that which is the most major challenge, in my opinion, is the weapon handover and the disarmament. This poses a very central risk. Now, Hamas is expected to surrender the tunnels, the rockets, the command posts, and other strategic arms under verification. It is expected, but if it stalls or obstructs the oversight process, the legitimacy of the deal is going to collapse from Israel's perspective, which obviously holds a much more bigger upper hand in the whole equation. So it will only resort to Hamas arguing that, oh, we're following through with the ceasefire despite our minor mishaps, but Israel is resorting to renewed violence again. Moreover, the internal fragmentation and dissent threats within Gaza, I believe, are real, and they are already manifesting. So Hamas has launched crackdowns against rival clans and militias. Most notably, we have the Dormush clan in Gaza City. And they're basically executing. They're executing informants, collaborators, spies. They're suppressing dissent, all in a public manner. And, despite the ceasefire, basically right now holding on a thread. So if such violence proliferates, either the central command loses control or the factions within provoke open clashes, which will undermine the central compliance process of the whole ceasefire. We also have to remember that political backlash within Israel itself is acute. We have ultra-far-right ministers and coalition partners of Netanyahu within the Israeli government, most notably Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich, and many other religious radical Zionist elements within Netanyahu's government have already denounced the deal as capitulation, threatening to pull support, and actually some of them have forced snap elections if concessions deepen. I think it's important to note that just last week, Smotrich himself was in Washington and met with Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary of the United States, and the readout was basically that Bessent is forcing Smotrich to really just hold in to the ceasefire and not risk the collapse of it, which is unusual given that we have a Secretary of Treasury and Minister of Finance. That's not usually the topics they're concerned about. We also have external spoiler intervention. That remains a latent danger. We have to remember that Hamas is not an independent body. It takes orders from Iran. Iran still retains influence over Hamas and other groups within the Strip like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PIJ. And it could, rearm. It could resupply the way it was resupplied before October 7th, given that there were 4 wars against Hamas before. So the extremist factions, ultra-extremist factions within Gaza might reject this armament altogether and challenge Hamas and bring altogether a foe that's even worse than Hamas. We also have to remember that the failure to commit to the reconstruction and also the humanitarian shortfalls constitute a structural risk. Now, if the Arabian Gulf funding or delivery operations lag or aid is blocked, civilian desperation may reignite violence and may actually back Hamas again. So there's roles that both sides need to take desperately, immediately, to prevent any lagging on their end. We also have to remember that if the US, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, or any other Arab state lose the political will, the attention, the resources to enforce compliance, both sides may perceive violations as costless and they just may give up on the process altogether. So given these multiple failure vectors, I personally assess a 40 to 50% chance probability of collapse within the first 6 to 12 months. But it will, be a lesser chance if the periods of transition, for example, full Israeli withdrawal or a successful governance handover, are implemented. Now, a more optimistic scenario grants a 20 to 30, let's say 20 to 40% chance of survival for the next 6 to 12 months, but only if early compliance is nearly flawless, which, as I've mentioned before, there's been a violation within the first 3 days of the ceasefire being effective. In essence, in practice, the most fragile multi-party ceasefires in the Middle East historically erode gradually rather than fail explosively. That's always been the case. They've never either succeeded from the very beginning or failed from the very beginning. It's a gradual process. So slow and creep violations are likelier than a sudden emergence of war again, but the possibility of unraveling it into a second cycle of violence still remains possible.
Abdullah, it's not like the Biden administration did not try to bring Israel and Hamas to the table. They really did, but somehow it just didn't work out. Either Israel was too adamant or Hamas was too adamant. But that's not the case right now. There is somewhat of a ceasefire agreement right now. And this is despite the fact that Israel and Hamas have a major trust deficit. So, what do you think Trump did differently? What major role or basically shift in talks did he bring when it comes to Israel and Hamas?
I think overcoming decades of enmity and broken ceasefires required not trust in the conventional sense, but a structural design that contains and constrains distrust, enforces accountability, and leverages external guarantors. Donald Trump's success in making this happen lies not in magically forging trust, but in building trust by architecture. To begin with, he insisted on a phased incremental model, which was very good in my opinion. The agreement is not all or nothing. That never works in the Middle East. Israel and Hamas, both of them, have to each commit to small, verifiable steps. An example would be within phase 1, release the 20 hostages first, then weapons handover, then phase 2, phase 3, government transition, all of that. It's a gradual process that, give and take. The sequencing of this means that neither side must place blind faith or full compliance from day one. Also, Trump elevated enforcement credibility. What does this mean? He basically warned through his many Truth Social posts that if Hamas refuses to disarm, the US and Israel will forcibly disarm it. Now, Trump's tone is getting more provocative and bold by the day. Everyone's seeing the clips of Trump's speeches, his engagements with the press, his statements. They're getting bolder and bolder and more cowboy-like. And this goes a long way if Trump really holds to it, and he has successively actually implemented such behavior. So this credible threat, I think, transforms the handshake into basically a high-stakes gamble, which raises the cost of default. Donald Trump also baked in third-party oversight and guarantees, and I think this was a tremendous step and very successful and very important that he did so. Qatar and Egypt are deliberately embedded into the structure as guarantors, as mediators, as monitors. They were tasked with diffusing mutual suspicion and adding reputational constraints on Hamas. We also have to remember Turkey's role. Now, Turkey has traditionally been absent from the Israeli-Palestinian negotiation process since the dawn of it. But we've seen Turkey's engagement with it over the past year and a half become obvious. Within the last few months, we can just say that the trajectory is enormous. Donald Trump and Erdogan convened a Arab Islamic sideline summit on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly in September in New York. Erdogan was sitting right next to him. Shortly after, a few days later, Erdogan visited the White House. Usually Erdogan speaks with the president on NATO issues, on the Kurds, on Syria, on Ukraine and Russia. But these two meetings with Trump and Netanyahu focused almost solely on Gaza. And Erdogan, according to Trump, personally intervened in the ceasefire process. And to his credit, I think it's important to give the Turks credit, because as soon as they entered the ceasefire mediation process, within 4 days we've had a breakthrough. That was not the case before, because the Turks were absent. They're like the substitute player at 90 minutes in a football match, and they come in and they bring the winning goal. So that has to be recognized. So that in extent basically shows that Trump's leverage and taking advantage of his strong relationship with Erdogan also played into his favor. Also, Donald Trump deployed material incentives. So the Arabian Gulf states pledged to fully fund the reconstruction, providing Hamas with a tangible payoff for compliance and, of course, an extent to the Gazan population. That will ultimately reduce the appeal of continued resistance, and the Gulf states are fully committed to that. And we've seen recently that Saudi Arabia in particular is still holding firm to not go through with any reconstruction funding unless Hamas fully complies with the ceasefire. So that also plays into Donald Trump's advantage, where his partners are committed to their roles in the ceasefire process. In addition to that, Trump used narrative framing and just rewording maneuvering that we haven't seen by a US president in regards to the conflict and peace process in general. He basically positioned himself as a bold peace broker. He tied his prestige to the deal's success. He really wanted the Nobel Peace Prize. He really advertised his successful ceasefire and war-ending accomplishments with countries like Azerbaijan and Armenia, India and Pakistan, Cambodia and Thailand, and many more. So for him, failure would damage not only the local actors, but it would damage him personally. So it really increased his own incentive to enforce the outcome. And I think we have to mention that the Trump administration the United States and the Trump administration had deep intelligence and negotiating leverage. So we have American, Israeli, Qatari, and Egyptian intelligence services deeply penetrating the command of Hamas, enabling the orchestration of conditional frameworks tailored to each faction's vulnerabilities. Initial confidence shocks were calibrated. So by securing the release of 20 living hostages quickly, Donald Trump provided an early payoff that signaled commitment. So like I mentioned before, the give and take is an extension on the long run beneficial. So that opening gesture is a classic move in a fragile diplomatic process. So you have to deliver before expectations, so the skeptics see legitimacy. So in sum, Trump didn't cure distrust. He boxed it in with a carefully designed mechanism of enforcement, monitoring, gradual steps, external oversight, and regional cooperation. So this architecture does not really eliminate risk, but it makes failure or defection costlier and the compliance of it more credible, at least within the early stages of this.
Abdullah, you began the conversation by briefly mentioning about the Gaza Peace Summit in Egypt's Sharm el-Sheikh. I want to talk a little about that. There were over 30 world leaders present. Of course, Donald Trump took the limelight, but ironically, Israel and Hamas were absent from this summit. A, why do you think that was? And B, do you think this summit was more about Trump rather than basically the Gaza peace plan?
So the summit functioned more as a diplomatic stage and legitimacy exercise than a negotiating forum. It was basically a signal blitz aimed at bolstering Trump's role, aggregating regional buy-in, institutionalizing the ceasefire as a collective international compact. Now, obviously, when you gather numerous world leaders in one space, it's a victory. Many big players were present. We had obviously Donald Trump, President El-Sisi of Egypt, Emir Tamim of Qatar, King Abdullah of Jordan, President Erdogan of Turkey, Keir Starmer of the UK, Macron, Meloni, numerous other big players were all present. And of course, we had President Mahmoud Abbas of Palestine. Now, Israel and Hamas are the two parties in which the ceasefire is about. So I don't think bringing them there, despite animosity between them and obviously the war, would have served anyone's interests. There were also leaked reports that Donald Trump wanted Netanyahu to be present, and President El-Sisi of Egypt initially agreed. But when President Erdogan of Turkey heard that he would be present, he was actually circling in the air, threatening that if Netanyahu's president is present, Erdogan's presidential aircraft would not land. Now, how true is that? But we've seen numerous sources talking about it. But anyway, the absence of Israel and Hamas basically underlines that this was not a forum for direct conflict resolution, but a symbolic rally. It was a symbolic rally for political cover, for political victory, for external pressure, basically. So with the over 30 heads of state, as you mentioned, the summit was co-chaired by President El-Sisi of Egypt and Donald Trump. They endorsed a declaration for enduring the peace. They lended legitimacy to the U.S. Peace architecture. They committed to Reconstruction pledges and applied public pressure on the warring parties. So really, Donald Trump used this summit as a media spectacle because, as we've all seen, all the negotiating, the mediation, the talking, the meetings, everything happened before that summit was even held. So maybe the summit was not the word that they should have used, but rather than the awarding ceremony or the signing process. So everything happened before. So he framed the ceasefire as his triumph, and he shared it with his partners, obviously. He really pushed his 20-point plan into the global narrative. Now, through the joint document signed at the summit, which everyone can view at the White House press release section, it includes many rules and regulations that I personally know that its substances are really vague and thin relative to the on-the-ground enforcement mechanisms, but that has traditionally been the case with any document relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So the summit, in essence, essentially served three political purposes. First, to lock in collective diplomatic support from the region so that any breach appears not just a bilateral default, but defiance of a regional consensus, which applies more pressure to both Israel and Hamas. So that was an important thing. Preempting spoiling efforts by securing public declarations from key Arab states was very important for Donald Trump, and he managed to do that. Thirdly, I think embedding the ceasefire within a broader peace narrative that frames Donald Trump, not simply Hamas or Israel, is the central guarantor. So in that sense, of all what was mentioned, yes, the summit was much about Trump's peace brand and projecting US influence as it was about peace per se. But that does not mean it lacked peace utility. By gathering all the pledges financially, diplomatically, regional oversight commitments, the summit could materialistically strengthen the guarantees underpinning the ceasefire only if those commitments are honored. So without Israel or Hamas present, I think it could not negotiate tactical details, but it heightened the stakes. It constrained future renegotiation and a renewed ceasefire mediation process that already took 2 years. So it was really just the cherry on top of the sundae, that summit in Sharm el-Sheikh.
Let's talk about Hamas, because I feel like we've not put a lot of light on what's happening within the group. They've agreed to disarm, and yes, this is a major point that is part of the ceasefire agreement. But videos are circulating on social media which shows Hamas gunmen basically shooting and killing anyone who's opposing them right now. What is really going on in Gaza?
I think that that's very important to talk about because Gaza today is a volatile crucible in which a forced transition is colliding with factual resistance, internal purges, and basically power networks, power struggles. Now, Hamas may publicly accept disarmament under the ceasefire framework, but internally, it is aggressively consolidating control through coercion, suppression, blackmailing, and lethal enforcement. Now, in multiple locales across Gaza, Hamas armed personnel have arrested, extrajudicially executed, forcibly disappeared individuals accused of dissent, accused of clan affiliation, accused of obviously collaboration with Israel, or anything else that Hamas sees as unfit. These operations intensify precisely in the zones vacated by Israel under the withdrawal clauses of the deal. So in Gaza City itself, there's many other clans and families, but who tops them all is the Dogomush clan, which is a long-standing rival faction of Hamas for the past 2 decades. It's clashed with Hamas forces in several neighborhoods. There have been exchanges of fire, house raids, arrests. It's really an ongoing process that's, I think, very undershown in the media right now. Many reports state that since October 14th till today, there have been dozens of deaths, numerous arrests, and obviously the footage on social media shows us the public executions in the streets as Hamas seeks to reassert as a unitary authority. So the apparent contradiction, which is disarmament versus killings, reflects a regime transformation in real time. The disarmament clause primarily targets external heavy military infrastructure, which, as I mentioned, were the rockets, the tunnels, the command centers, the ammo depots. It does not necessarily target all internal policing capacity and administration capacity of Hamas, in Gaza. So, meanwhile, Hamas views internal dissent or armed opposition, especially by these powerful rival clans, as existential threats to the integrity of the agreement. So it is, in return, very brutal in enforcing the discipline before the external verification fully kicks in. With that said, in effect, Hamas is trying to clear the field of internal rivals before handing over or reducing its weaponry, thereby centralizing coercive control on its own terms. That also helps it negotiate from a stronger position in the transitional power structure from Hamas's standpoint. Moreover, many of these acts are framed publicly as restoring order, cracking down on looting, spies, collaborators, and chaos. So that is really playing into Hamas's role as the good guy. So Hamas claims to be preventing civil anarchy in a devastated territory through human rights and international monitors. They really view this as violations of the due process or outright war crimes, which I personally agree. And as I mentioned before, the interface of social media, the wide spread of the social media footage of this, it's further complicating things. The violent videos of Hamas gunmen executing dissenters really intensify scrutiny on Hamas's true intent. The public disarmament commitment is largely aimed at external audiences, which is Israel, the US, the Arab states. While on the ground, it is obvious that Hamas is scrambling to eliminate fragmentation, resist internal challenges, and control the narrative before its capacity is constrained by external monitors.
Right. Hamas seems to be consolidating its power right now, and it's basically against what is written in the ceasefire agreement. But let's say Hamas does eventually disarm. Who will actually have control over Gaza then?
I think that the future governance of Gaza is the most contested and delicate component of the ceasefire architecture in its entirety. Under the publicly available framework, full Hamas governance is not part of the long-term plan. It is fully out of it. Instead, administrative and executive control is slated to shift to a new technocratic transitional body with transitional Arab and international security forces anchoring stabilization. So in practice, the plan envisions a phased handover. Once Hamas demonstrates compliance on disarmament, allows oversight, and cedes its military functions, that new Palestinian body will expand its administrative presence, civil services, and policing roles. We already have a joint Arab International Stabilization Force, which includes forces from Egypt and Jordan and many other Arab states that will oversee border security, high-level policing, and verification for a designated transition period. Some models even propose that the Gaza City policing mechanism and neighborhood security will remain under a new Palestinian body, but the strategic security elements like checkpoints, border zones, will remain under the peacekeeping contingent of the Arab International Security Force. So the rationale is to provide Israel and external guarantors confidence that Gaza will not reconstitute as a military threat, while giving Palestinians a good degree of local self-governance. However, this transition is really riddled with risk. We don't know who that Palestinian body is going to be, because we've seen that the Israelis and the Americans really don't want the Palestinian Authority to come in. The Palestinian Authority is already resented by segments of the population as corrupt and ineffectual in Gaza, and an extension to that in the West Bank. So Hamas is likely to retain informal influence via the social networks, the welfare organizations, the clandestine structures, and legacy personnel. The balance of power may be more hybrid than binary, and while any future Palestinian body may hold nominal executive control, Hamas could remain a potent political actor, especially if internal oversight is lax. So the Joint Arab Force, for its part, may act as a security umbrella or a guarantor buffer, intervening in failure scenarios and bridging trust gaps will really play the key role in that. So personally, in my opinion, I believe that the only body of Palestinian technocrats or administrators that should be entrusted with control of Gaza should be the Palestinian Authority. No hybrid or parallel governance model will bring lasting stability. Now, for the record, I am no fan of the Palestinian Authority in its current form. I believe they have many issues to deal with, but the Palestinian Authority is the solely internationally recognized representative of the Palestinian people. Consolidating its authority in Gaza is essential to unify Palestinian governance, which will revive diplomacy. It will rebuild its institutional legitimacy, which will help the two-state solution get back on track. However, that legitimacy must not come automatically. It requires a comprehensive, internationally backed reform drive. The same energy and funding and diplomatic focus that the world mobilized to end the war in Gaza must now be redirected toward pressuring and assisting the Palestinian Authority to reform, which should include modernizing its bureaucracy, fighting corruption, enhancing its security services, reconnecting with the Gazan population through a transparent service delivery mechanism. And that entails the pivotal roles of international actors such as the United States, Europe, the Arabian Gulf states, and of course the key players of Egypt and Jordan. They should all link all future assistance to concrete reform benchmarks inside the PA to ensure it evolves into an accountable, effective authority that is capable of governing both Gaza and the West Bank. And I think that without such reform, any transfer of power to the Palestinian Authority risks repeating the failures and environment that allowed Hamas to come back and power in the first place.
Abdullah, very quickly, because we're running out of time, what do you think happens next in context of Israel? Has the far right accepted the terms and conditions of the ceasefire? Basically, what I want to get at is what next for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Is Bibi staring at the end of his political career?
I think yes. I think Netanyahu's days are numbered in terms of political power. The aftermath of the deal is already triggering intense political convulsions in Israel that may reshape leadership and coalition dynamics internally in Israel. The ultra-far right ministers and parties have openly denounced the deal as capitulation to Hamas, and they have accused Netanyahu of betraying Israel's interests. Netanyahu is attempting to thread a narrow line. He publicly reaffirms that Hamas must disarm or face renewed military pressure, but he has also accepted the framework of the ceasefire and committed to its initial terms for Israel's advantage. We're seeing him re-engage on the media stage very often right now, and his basic punching point is that if I didn't do what I did in Gaza, Israel's days would be numbered. The traditional "we're surrounded, we're under threat" Israeli talking point. Now, this tightrope act might not survive the next few months, especially if the internal coalition partners withdraw support. Netanyahu's political footing is already fragile. There are corruption prosecutions, criticism of his wartime strategy, delaying in bringing back the hostages, and of course the electoral cycle all loom in the background. Now, this may mark the beginning of the end of his dominance if his coalition fractures or loses public confidence. I think in the near term, we may see desperate political maneuvering, which includes reshuffling ministries, concessions to hardliners on other fronts, or push for early elections to re-legitimize authority. So I think Netanyahu is operating on thinning ice. I think his long tenure looks increasingly vulnerable unless he can hold his coalition together and show the world and basically his people that tangible security dividends from the deal really worked out in their favor and not just his own political interest.
Thank you, Abdullah, for these valuable insights and for speaking to Fair Observer.
Of course, it's always a pleasure to be here, Rohan, and I appreciate you as always.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.